Hey drifters, are you ready to produce? On today's episode of Catch Your Drift, we will be talking about the next two subjects in this series around dynamics: saturation and soft clipping. Alright riders, one of the main things that we want to talk about today is saturation. Saturation can be described in a variety of ways. The way I like to think of it mostly is that usually saturation adds some color to whatever you're applying it to. So for example, if you're putting on a vocal, saturation will start to give it a different character. It may make it sound warmer, it may make it sound brighter, but it will start adding something to it. One of the reasons that it does this is that it's actually adding something called harmonics to it. So you're actually adding frequencies at different intervals over the course of that moment by moment sound. And that does a few different things. For one, it makes that sound cut through the mix much better. It also starts to reduce that dynamic range. So before we even get to compression, before we even get to limiting or clipping or any of that kind of stuff, just saturation in of itself will start to kind of reduce that dynamic range. So for example, let's take a look at this waveform real quickly. You can see this is just kind of an overall waveform. Let's just say it's a vocal, for instance. Saturation, essentially what it's going to do is you're going to start adding low levels of extra information along the way. And there's very technical ways you can explain that with it's happening at certain specific intervals. But the main point to understand is that you're adding more harmonic content. So you're actually enriching the sounds in a lot of ways. Now, that can be wonderful, but it can also be dangerous. It's great because of the reasons I said, but it can also be dangerous because if you overdo saturation, you're going to get sounding very, very distorted and it can get sounding unpleasant. Another important topic as it relates to saturation is that this can actually happen in a whole variety of ways. For instance, saturation can happen when you're soft clipping, it can happen when you're compressing, it can happen when you're limiting. In some cases, some limiters are very clean, others are not. Hard clipping, for sure, it's going to happen. And maximizing, I would say it can happen, although it's generally pretty clean as well. Again, that can come down to what kind of tool you're using. Another thing that's very important to think about saturation is you don't actually have to be applying any kind of gain reduction where you're actually, or intentionally gain reducing, I should say, pulling down any of those dynamics, bringing down any of those peaks. Saturation can happen just through running it through certain types of old analog compressors, old EQs, and a lot of that has also been modeled into modern plugins. So those are all very important things to think about when you're talking about saturation. Basically, just applying a plugin or putting a sound through a piece of hardware, they can add some of that harmonics or overtones, they're also called at times. So they can happen that way, but then of course they can also happen as you're using those tools to kind of change the waveforms in different ways. Now that we've talked about saturation a little bit, the next thing I want to do is talk about soft clipping. Now, soft clipping is, in a lot of ways, it's kind of very similar to, it's almost like another word for saturation, although it's doing it in a very specific way. When you're doing soft clipping, essentially what you're doing is you're going to have a waveform such as this, and it's going to kind of round off the peaks in a not hard way, because hard clipping we'll get to later, but soft clipping, it's basically going to do something like this. So it's going to come in and it's going to kind of round off the peak a little bit. I'll give another drawing just to make sure that we really understand what it's doing. Imagine that is the sound frequency. Basically, it's going to go like this. It's going to round off that peak in a way that is soft. And there's different types of tools that will do this soft clipping in different ways. You can get very soft ones that would be more like this. Or you can get ones that are very quick, almost like hard clipping, and there's a whole range in between. But again, basically what that's doing is that it's trimming off the peak in a soft way. That can be great on a variety of different sounds. I would say that soft clipping in general you can apply to most things without too much of a danger of overly distorting it. However, like everything, you don't want to overdo it. And when you're doing this, you really want to be listening to what you're doing. Meters can be good, they can tell you different things, but the important thing is sound is always to use your ears. Now, as you can see, riders, as you start to do these different things, whether you're doing some saturation just by putting in plugins or you're doing soft clipping by rounding off some peaks, that's going to start changing the sounds that are going through your mix. Again, think of this as though it is a vocal. So just take that soft clip that we just did there, for instance. Essentially, it would do something like this ultimately. basically would do something to that nature where it's going to kind of smooth it off. It's not totally clipping it off the way a hard clipper would, but it's going to smoothly do it. And so as you do that throughout your mix and you do it on all the different instruments that you're working on that you want to reduce the range on, what you can do is start to slowly bring down those dynamics so that way they're getting closer and closer together. Again, anywhere that you feel that it's necessary. The important thing with this is that you want to do it in stages. If you do this in a big way, for instance, let's say you take a soft clipper and you turn it up really high so you're really clipping a lot. That is going to be a lot more destructive. So let's say, for instance, that this would be like, 8 decibels of reduction, and this is maybe 1. If you reduce in stages, 1 here, 1.5 there, 2 there, and you do it across a range of ways, whether that's saturation, limiting, compression, maximizing, whatever you're doing, overall, usually when you do these things a little bit at a time, you get a much more pleasant sound. Another thing that's important is that, as we mentioned earlier, all these different tools that you use, whether they're compressors or EQs, plugins, or analog, actual equipment, they're all going to add different types of sounds to it. So you're going to get different character, different saturation from all that as well. So when you do these things a little bit at a time, you can really enhance the overall sound that way. And that's a very important part of the way records have been traditionally made in the past. Okay, Riders, I think that's a great place to wrap it up for today. In our next episode, we will be talking about compression. That's a fun subject. See you then, Riders.